For over 5 decades, Dustin Hoffman has been one of Hollywood's most enigmatic figures, a man who transformed cinema with his raw vulnerability, yet remained fiercely protective of his deepest secrets. Behind the iconic performances that defined a generation, behind the Oscar victories and standing ovations, lay a story so profound, so deeply personal, that he kept it locked away for nearly 8 decades. Today, at 80 years old, the legendary actor has finally decided to speak. What he's about to reveal will forever change how you see the man behind Benjamin Braddock, Dorothy Michaels, and Raymond Babbitt. This is the truth Dustin Hoffman never wanted the world to know until now. Long before the cameras rolled, before the spotlight found him, Dustin Lee Hoffman was just a small boy in Los Angeles, carrying a weight no child should ever bear. Born in 1937 to Harry and Lillian Hoffman, Dustin grew up in a household where silence spoke louder than words, where unspoken truths hung heavy in the air like fog over the California coast. His father, Harry, was a prop supervisor at Columbia Pictures, a man who worked behind the scenes in a world of make-believe, yet couldn't escape the harsh realities of his own life. Little did the world know, Harry Hoffman struggled with demons that would cast long shadows over his son's formative years. The elder Hoffman was a man of few words, but when he did speak, his voice carried the weight of disappointment in himself, in his circumstances, and perhaps most devastatingly, in the small boy who looked up to him with hopeful eyes. Dustin's mother, Lillian, was a former jazz singer who had traded her dreams for domesticity. She filled their modest home with music. But beneath her melodic facade lay a woman grappling with her own unfulfilled aspirations. The young Dustin would watch his mother at the piano, her fingers dancing across keys that seemed to unlock emotions she couldn't express in words. It was here, in these quiet moments, that Dustin first understood the power of performance, the way it could reveal truth while simultaneously hiding it. At school, Dustin was the outsider, the boy who never quite fit in, standing barely 5 feet tall, even as a teenager, with unconventional features and an intensity that made others uncomfortable. He learned early that the world wasn't designed for people like him. His classmates called him names, mocked his appearance, and left him eating lunch alone day after day. But what they didn't know, what even Dustin couldn't articulate at the time, was that these moments of isolation were forging something extraordinary within him. The truth no one dared to say was that Dustin Hoffman's childhood was a masterclass in observation. Every slight, every moment of rejection, every whispered conversation he wasn't supposed to hear was being catalogued in his young mind. He was learning to read people, to understand the disconnect between what they said and what they meant. He was developing the very skills that would one day make him one of cinema's most authentic performers, but at a cost that would haunt him for decades. When Dustin Hoffman looked in the mirror as a young man, he saw a reflection that Hollywood had taught him to despise. This wasn't the face of a leading man, it was the face of an outsider, a character actor at best, someone destined to play the friend, the sidekick, the comic relief. But finally revealed, after decades of silence, is the devastating impact this realization had on the young Hoffman's psyche. At 19, standing in his cramped bathroom in a Los Angeles boarding house, Dustin made a decision that would define his relationship with himself for the next 60 years. He would never try to be conventionally handsome. Instead, he would weaponize his differences, transform his perceived flaws into his greatest strengths. Little did the world know, this moment of brutal self-acceptance would birth one of the most revolutionary approaches to acting Hollywood had ever seen. His acting teacher, Sanford Meisner, was the first person to see past Dustin's unconventional appearance to the raw talent burning beneath. But even Meisner couldn't have predicted the psychological toll this journey would take. Dustin threw himself into method acting with an obsession that bordered on self-destruction. He didn't just inhabit characters, he disappeared into them, using their fictional lives as an escape from his own complex relationship with identity and self-worth. The mirror became both his enemy and his greatest teacher. Every morning, he would stare at his reflection, cataloging the features that made casting directors hesitate, the imperfections that traditional Hollywood rejected. But instead of changing himself, he changed the industry's definition of what a star could look like. He was preparing to break every rule, to shatter every preconceived notion about what it meant to be a leading man in America. What the public never knew was that behind this revolutionary confidence lay a young man terrified of his own reflection, afraid that if he looked too long, he might see something even more devastating than an unconventional face. He might see the truth about who he really was beneath all the performance, all the carefully constructed personas he was learning to wear like armor. The year was 1967, and Mike Nichols was searching for someone to play Benjamin Braddock in The Graduate, a role that would define a generation's disillusionment and rebellion. What happened in that audition room was more than just a career-making moment. It was the collision of a director's vision with an actor's deepest vulnerabilities, creating cinematic magic that would echo through the decades. Dustin walked into that room carrying 30 years of rejection, 30 years of being told he wasn't leading man material, The other actors auditioning looked like they'd stepped off a magazine photo, conventionally handsome, everything Hollywood traditionally celebrated. But when Dustin began to read, something extraordinary happened. The room fell silent, not from boredom or disappointment, but from recognition. Here was someone who understood Benjamin's alienation, not as an acting exercise, but as a lived experience. Mike Nichols later revealed that he knew within minutes that he'd found his Benjamin, but what he couldn't have known was the personal cost this role would exact from its star. Dustin didn't just play Benjamin Braddock. He excavated parts of himself he'd kept buried, used his own feelings of not belonging, his own complicated relationship with authority and expectation, to bring the character to life. The truth finally revealed is that Dustin's performance in The Graduate wasn't just acting, it was autobiography disguised as fiction. Every moment of Benjamin's confusion, his inability to connect, his sense of being trapped between childhood and adulthood, came directly from Dustin's own experience. He was playing himself, and the world was watching without knowing it. Little did audiences realize that when Benjamin Braddock stared through that bedroom window, watching the world from the outside, they were seeing Dustin Hoffman's truest self, a man who had spent his entire life feeling like an observer of other people's lives, never quite certain where he belonged in the story. The performance that would make him a star was also the beginning of his lifelong struggle with the boundary between performance and reality, between Dustin Hoffman the actor and Dustin Hoffman the man. Overnight, Dustin Hoffman became the face of a generation, but fame brought with it a crushing realization that would haunt him for decades. When The Graduate exploded into cultural phenomenon, when his face appeared on magazine covers and his name became synonymous with the new Hollywood, Dustin discovered something terrifying. The world was falling in love with a character, not the man who played him. The sudden transformation from struggling actor to cultural icon left Dustin reeling. He had spent his entire life feeling invisible, and now he couldn't walk down the street without being recognized. But the recognition came with a price. People weren't seeing Dustin Hoffman, they were seeing Benjamin Braddock, projecting their own rebellions and alienations onto a man who was still figuring out his own identity. In private moments, away from the cameras and the interviews, Dustin would sit in his apartment, wondering if anyone would ever know the real him. The fame he had dreamed of had become a prison, trapping him behind a persona that was simultaneously authentic and artificial. He was famous for being himself, but which self was the real one? The vulnerable young man from Los Angeles, or the confident movie star the world had created? What the public never saw were the panic attacks that began during this period. The nights when Dustin would wake up in cold sweats, overwhelmed by the responsibility of representing something larger than himself. He had become a symbol of authenticity in an industry built on illusion, and the irony wasn't lost on him. The more authentic his performances appeared, the more he felt like a fraud in his own life. Little did the world know, this internal conflict would drive every career choice he made going forward. Each role became an opportunity to explore different aspects of identity, different ways of being human, as if he could discover who Dustin Hoffman really was by playing everyone except himself. The truth no one dared to say was that success had made him more lost than failure ever had. When Dustin Hoffman put on a dress and became Dorothy Michaels in Tootsie, he thought he was simply taking on another challenging role. What he discovered during those months of filming would fundamentally alter his understanding of himself, his relationships, and the very nature of identity. Finally revealed, after 4 decades of silence, is the profound psychological journey that occurred behind the makeup and costumes of his most transformative performance. The process of becoming Dorothy began months before filming. Dustin worked with makeup artists and voice coaches, learning to walk in heels, to carry himself with feminine grace, to speak in a voice that wasn't his own. But something unexpected happened during these preparations. For the first time in his life, Dustin felt truly invisible. Dressed as Dorothy, he could walk through the world unrecognized, observing life from an entirely different perspective. What struck him most profoundly was how differently people treated Dorothy compared to Dustin. Men who had been competitive colleagues became protective and condescending. Women who had maintained professional distance suddenly opened up, sharing confidences and vulnerabilities they never would have revealed to a male actor. Dustin realized he was experiencing firsthand the different ways society treated people based on gender, and the revelation was both enlightening and devastating. But the most shocking discovery came when Dustin looked in the mirror as Dorothy, and felt something he had never experienced before. He liked what he saw, not because Dorothy was beautiful in any conventional sense, but because she was free from the expectations placed on Dustin Hoffman, free from the masculine posturing that had defined his career, free to express vulnerability and emotion in ways that men of his generation had been taught to suppress. Little did the world know that during filming, Dustin would sometimes forget he was playing a character. There were moments when Dorothy felt more real than Dustin, when the performance became so natural that the boundaries between actor and role completely dissolved. The truth no one dared to say was that Tootsie wasn't just about a man pretending to be a woman. It was about a man discovering parts of himself he never knew existed. When Dustin Hoffman became a father, he made a promise that would define the rest of his life. He would be everything his own father couldn't be. But what the world never knew was how terrified he was of failing. How the cycles of emotional distance and unfulfilled dreams that had marked his childhood threatened to repeat themselves in his own family. His first marriage to Anne Byrne was a casualty of his rising fame and his inability to balance the demands of his career with the intimacy required for partnership. The truth, finally revealed, is that Dustin was so consumed with proving himself as an actor that he forgot to learn how to be a husband, how to be present for someone who loved him for who he was rather than what he could perform. When his children were born, Jenna, Jacob, Rebecca, Max, Ollie, and finally Jake, Dustin faced his greatest challenge yet. These small beings didn't care about his Oscar nominations or his box office successes. They needed him to be simply and authentically present, something he had spent his entire career learning to fake convincingly. The irony was crushing. A man celebrated for his emotional authenticity on screen struggled to express genuine emotion in his own home, but slowly, painfully, beautifully. His children taught him what no acting teacher ever could. They showed him that love didn't require performance, that being enough didn't mean being perfect, that presence mattered more than presentation. Little did the world know, some of Dustin's most powerful performances in later years were directly inspired by lessons his children taught him about vulnerability and authentic connection. The weight of breaking generational patterns was enormous. Every bedtime story, every school play, every moment of simply listening became an act of revolution against his own upbringing. He was determined to give his children the emotional availability he had craved as a boy, even if it meant learning how to be vulnerable all over again, this time without the safety of a character to hide behind. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, as Hollywood transformed around him, Dustin Hoffman found himself fighting a battle that most audiences never knew existed. While younger actors embodied a different kind of masculinity, while action heroes dominated the box office, Dustin remained committed to the psychological complexity that had made him famous. But this commitment came at a cost that would test everything he believed about art, commerce, and integrity. Critics began to dismiss him as overly intense, too method desirable for audiences who wanted entertainment over enlightenment. What they didn't understand, what finally can be revealed, is that Dustin wasn't choosing difficult roles to be difficult. He was choosing them because they reflected the complexity he saw in real human beings. Every character was an attempt to show that heroism could exist in ordinary people, that extraordinary stories could emerge from seemingly mundane lives. The industry's shift toward blockbuster entertainment left little room for the kind of intimate character studies that had built Dustin's career. Executives wanted stars who could carry franchises, not actors who disappeared so completely into roles that audiences forgot they were watching performances. This created a professional crisis that mirrored his personal struggles with identity. Was he an artist or an entertainer? And could someone be both in modern Hollywood? Behind closed doors, Dustin wrestled with the relevance of his approach to acting in an industry increasingly driven by marketing demographics and global appeal. He watched contemporaries compromise their artistic vision for commercial success, and he faced a choice that would define his later career: adapt to the industry's demands or remain true to his artistic principles, regardless of the professional consequences. Little did the world know, this period of professional uncertainty coincided with a personal awakening that would ultimately inform his most meaningful work. The truth, no one dared to say, was that being dismissed by critics taught Dustin something valuable about the difference between being understood and being seen, between popular acclaim and artistic integrity. In 2013, at the age of 75, Dustin Hoffman faced his greatest fear: the possibility that his story might end before he was ready to tell it. The cancer diagnosis that he kept largely private from the public was more than a health scare. It was a confrontation with mortality that forced him to examine what truly mattered in the time he had remaining. Sitting in sterile hospital rooms, undergoing treatments that left him weak and vulnerable, Dustin experienced something he had spent decades trying to access through method: acting, absolute, unfiltered truth. There were no characters to hide behind, no roles to disappear into. Just Dustin Hoffman, facing the possibility of an ending, wondering what he would leave behind beyond a filmography and a handful of awards. The treatment was successful, but the experience left permanent marks on his psyche. For the first time in his life, Dustin began to consider legacy, not in terms of career achievements, but in terms of human connections. He started reaching out to people he had lost touch with, began having conversations he had avoided for years, started examining relationships he had prioritized below his professional ambitions. What the world never knew was how this brush with mortality changed his approach to acting. Roles that might have once appealed to his ego now seemed meaningless unless they offered opportunities for genuine human exploration. He became more selective, not because he could afford to be, but because time had revealed itself as finite and precious.